The arrival of the plague. The first signs came quietly and without warning, like whispers carried on the wind that no one wanted to hear. People in small towns began to feel weak with sudden fevers and uncontrollable coughing. At first it was dismissed as a seasonal illness, but then the cases grew too many too fast and far too severe for comfort. Hospitals filled overnight with patients gasping for air, their bodies weakened as if something inside them was eating away at their strength. Scientists tested every sample, and yet none of the usual cures worked. It was as if this sickness was made to resist everything humanity had ever created. What no one on Earth knew was that far above, in the cold silence of space, a coalition of alien warlords watched and waited. Their plan had been simple. They would release their most advanced biological weapon on humanity and let nature do the rest. Their plague had wiped out entire civilizations before it was designed to adapt and overwhelm to crush immune systems and turn strong bodies into frail shells. The aliens had debated whether humanity even deserved such an effort. Some argued that humans were already too chaotic, too divided, and would fall without resistance. But others insisted that Earth had shown too much potential in recent centuries, too much innovation, too much spirit. And so the plague was chosen as the ultimate test. If humanity could be erased, then Earth would never rise to threaten the galaxy. On the ground, fear spread. Like wildfire, families huddled in their homes, afraid to step outside, cities locked down, airports closed, borders sealed. But still the sickness seeped through, like smoke through cracks. No wall could stop it. Children cried in hospital beds while their parents prayed for miracles that did not come. Leaders spoke on every channel, their voices trembling as they urged calm while soldiers tried to keep order. But no army could march against something invisible. It was as if the whole planet was under siege by an enemy that no one could see. In laboratories across the world, scientists worked day and night searching for an answer. They mixed medicines, they tested every antiviral known to humankind. But the pathogen laughed at their efforts. Each attempt crumbled as the sickness only grew stronger. Doctors felt helpless. Nurses broke down in tears while corridors echoed with the sound of coughing and desperate cries. The news called it the Black Wind, the silent death, the unstoppable. Wave panic deepened until even the most rational minds whispered that maybe this was the end. In the alien command chamber far from Earth, monitors displayed the chaos in real-time, streets filled with empty cars, hospitals overflowing mass graves. Dug in haste, one commander leaned back with a satisfied grin. This was what he had expected. Another victory. Another species brought low with ease, but not all shared his confidence. A few watched more carefully, noting that humans did not collapse. The way others had, they fought tooth and nail. They refused to simply lie down and die even in their sickness. They clung to each other, offering comfort, sharing food, singing songs at windows to remind their neighbors that they were not alone. It was not victory yet, but it was resistance back on Earth among the fear. Small stories began to rise in the dark corners of forgotten towns. Doctors and volunteers noticed something strange. Not everyone who fell ill stayed ill. Some patients recovered, faster than expected, and not through medicine but through something far simpler. These were the whispers that would later become legend. But in these early days, no one could imagine that the fate of humanity might rest, not in laboratories or armies, but in kitchens where pots boiled and steam carried hope into the air. The plague had arrived to conquer. But humanity, though bent and broken, had not yet bowed. Would this sickness finish what so many alien warlords desired? Or would Earth once again show that it was not like any other world that had come before? The answer was hidden still in the suffering of millions. Yet a spark glowed faintly, waiting for its chance to burn bright and turn despair into defiance. Desperation in the cities. The sickness did not slow. It spread with a hunger that seemed endless, and soon every major city on Earth felt the weight of its advance. The lights of New York still burned, but the streets were empty as fear drove people inside. London fell silent, except for the wail of sirens carrying patients to overflowing hospitals in Tokyo. The train lines, once crowded with rushing workers, now stood abandoned, while soldiers guarded barricades that could not stop what was already inside. People looked from their windows at ghostly streets and wondered if this was how humanity would vanish. not with war or fire, but with a whisper of illness. Doctors worked until their hands trembled and their eyes burned with exhaustion. Entire hospitals turned into war zones where the enemy was not a soldier but something unseen. They wore protective gear, but even that felt like paper shields against an unstoppable tide. Nurses collapsed in hallways, yet rose again when another patient cried for help. Families brought their loved ones only to be turned away because there were no beds left. Some slept in parking lots waiting for a chance that never came. The air in the cities felt heavy, not just with disease but with dread. Governments tried to respond, but their voices carried little comfort. Every speech promising unity felt hollow when death was at the door. Leaders ordered quarantines and soldiers patrolled the streets, but the virus flowed like water, ignoring barriers as if mocking. The idea of control supplies grew scarce. Masks, medicines, and food vanished from shelves as people fought over scraps. Desperation painted every corner of society. Yet still there was no answer. From science laboratories produced reports that only confirmed failure. Every drug tested, every serum designed fell apart against the plague as though it had been built to crush hope itself. In the shadows of this despair, people clung to whatever fragments of life they could hold. Neighbors shared what food they had, communities formed makeshift kitchens, and volunteers risked their own lives to deliver meals to those too weak to stand in cramped apartments. Families tried to shield the sick with blankets and care because there was nothing else to give. Children asked their parents if the world would still be here tomorrow, and the silence of unanswered questions weighed heavier than any words. Among the alien commanders who watched from afar, triumph grew. They had seen this scene play out across other planets, and the ending was always the same. Civilizations collapsed and their worlds fell silent. The humans would be no different, or so they believed. Yet a few noted something unusual. Earth was not breaking evenly, while despair was vast. There were pockets of resistance, some communities where people recovered faster than expected, places where the sickness did not end in death as often as the data predicted. At first, this was dismissed as error, but whispers grew even among the alien strategists that humanity might not fall so easily. In one city, a small clinic run by exhausted doctors and volunteers recorded recoveries that defied explanation. The staff began to wonder if their attention and comfort were somehow playing a role, though they dared not believe it fully. Still, the numbers showed a truth that could not be ignored. Patients who were given warmth, not just medicines but care, seemed to survive at higher rates. One nurse kept a journal noting down every strange case, and her records would later become a beacon, though at the time she felt only confusion. The world continued to drown in suffering. Yet beneath the flood, a current of resistance flowed unseen. Every hand that held another, every voice that offered comfort, every pot of food shared in the cold streets. These were not victories in the way generals recorded them, but they were battles. Nonetheless, the plague wanted silence and despair, but humanity gave it noise and stubborn defiance. Even as the aliens watched, believing victory was near, they failed to see the shape of what was coming, for the answer to their plague was not locked in laboratories or military bunkers. It was waiting in kitchens and homes where ancient traditions carried forward by generations still held quiet power. The cities cried with desperation, but within that sorrow a strange strength began to grow, unseen and unmeasured, yet waiting for its chance to be revealed. The unexpected resistance. The world was sinking deeper into despair, yet in the middle of that storm, faint glimmers of hope began to surface, unnoticed by governments and alien watchers at first. In a crowded clinic on the edge of a forgotten town, the doctors and nurses who had almost given up began to see patterns they had not expected. Patients who had been left with little chance of survival began to recover slowly but surely. The strange part was that these recoveries were not connected to any medicine. No new drug had been invented. No miracle cure had arrived from the laboratories. The only link the exhausted staff could find was something almost too simple to believe. Families who had stayed by the bedsides of their loved ones had done what families had always done. They cooked. For them, they tried to bring comfort in any way they could. Some brought homemade stews, some brought herbal teas. But the one that appeared again and again was a simple bowl of chicken soup. Steaming hot, fragrant, and warm, the doctors dismissed it, at first as Coincidence, yet the evidence grew stronger with every passing day. The patients who received such comfort began to rise again. Their fevers broke. Their strength returned slowly but steadily. It was as though the plague had found its match, not in laboratories filled with technology, but in kitchens filled with tradition. The staff began to keep records, though they feared ridicule if anyone saw them. One nurse named Elena made detailed notes in her worn notebook. She tracked which patients ate and drank the soup and which did not. The results unsettled her but also filled her with cautious hope. Those who were given broth tended to recover faster and survive, where others faded. Her colleagues laughed nervously when she suggested it, but deep down they could see what she saw. Something was happening, something that could not be ignored for long. Word spread quietly at first, like ripples in water. Families told neighbors. Neighbors told strangers. Soon, in the midst of dark streets, where fear ruled, people began to cook together. Kitchens became more important than pharmacies. Large pots bubbled in community centers, and the sick were fed by volunteers who had nothing else to give. The plague that was supposed to erase humanity was now being met not by armies or laboratories, but by shared meals. The smell of boiling broth drifted through alleys and carried with it something stronger than medicine. It carried hope. Scientists at first rejected these stories, calling them superstition born from desperation. Yet eventually they too could not ignore the growing number of cases. Entire districts reported lower death rates where the soup was shared compared to places where it was not. Skeptics argued it was chance or error, but numbers spoke louder than pride, and the whispers reached official ears. Laboratories began to test the broth, breaking it down into compounds and nutrients. What they discovered startled them. Certain natural properties weakened the grip of the pathogen, giving the immune system a chance to fight back. The plague had been engineered to resist advanced medicine, but it had not expected to face something so ancient, so simple, so human. In the alien command chamber, the mood began to shift. Data from Earth confused their analysts. Projections showed collapse, but survival rates were higher than predicted. The commanders demanded answers, but their scientists had none. They could not fathom how such a primitive world was resisting their ultimate plague. When they learned the truth, disbelief turned to anger. To be defeated by something as trivial as soup was not only unexpected, it was humiliating. Some raged that the data was false. Others began to sense something deeper, a truth. They had long ignored, that humanity was not like the others on Earth. The discovery did not erase the suffering, but it lit a spark. Where there had only been darkness, communities that had been silent with despair, now filled with the sound of spoons clattering in pots and voices encouraging the weak. Kitchens became battlegrounds and families became soldiers, armed not with guns but with recipes. The plague still raged, but its power had been challenged for the first time. Humanity did not yet understand the scale of what it had uncovered, but a shift had begun. Despair was giving way to defiance. Grief was being balanced by determination. The aliens had thought Earth would crumble quickly, but instead, they had woken something stubborn and enduring, and it was only the beginning of the fight. The world takes notice. At first, the reports were ignored, buried under the mountain of fear and official statements that promised a scientific breakthrough that never came. But whispers are harder to silence than any government decree. And soon those whispers became undeniable. Stories from small towns reached the great cities. Tales of families who recovered with nothing more than a warm bowl of broth. Tales of communities where death slowed when kitchens filled with steam and the sick were cared for with ancient remedies that had been passed down for generations. The idea sounded foolish and unscientific, yet in the middle of despair, even foolish hope was worth chasing. Doctors, who once laughed at the suggestion of soup as medicine, began to take note. Journals filled with crude data began to circulate between clinics, and slowly a pattern emerged. It was not a miracle, but it was something real. The broth contained elements that reduced inflammation, restored hydration, and gave the body just enough strength to push back against the disease. Laboratories tested samples and confirmed what families already knew. The plague could be resisted, not defeated entirely, but resisted, and in that resistance lay humanity's first true victory. Governments who had once clung to silence were forced to acknowledge the truth as numbers piled up and public pressure grew. Leaders who had spoken of unity now spoke of kitchens and families. And volunteers, they organized networks to distribute food on a scale that had never been attempted before, in stadiums and schools. Great vats of soup were prepared by volunteers and handed out to lines of sick and fearful citizens in neighborhoods. Where fear had sealed doors, people now opened them to share meals with strangers. What had been desperation was slowly transforming into defiance. Scientists worked alongside cooks in a strange alliance that the world had never seen before. Laboratories refined the recipes, strengthening their effect, while grandmothers and mothers and fathers insisted on the value of tradition. What was once dismissed as folk wisdom became the foundation of survival. The most powerful nations on Earth diverted resources not to weapons or new machines, but to chickens, vegetables, and the simple act of cooking. Kitchens became the factories of war, and every ladle poured into a bowl was an act of resistance against the unseen enemy. Far above Earth, the alien coalition seethed. Their ultimate plague was not spreading as predicted. Their models predicted collapse, yet Earth was stabilizing, not recovering fully. But holding strong commanders demanded explanations. Their scientists stammered, unable to believe the data. One enraged warlord shouted that it was impossible, that no world had ever resisted the plague before. To be defeated by food was unthinkable. And yet the proof unfolded in every image streamed from Earth. Streets once silent were alive, again with people helping each other. Communities once drowning in despair now stood with renewed strength. The aliens could not comprehend the nature of what they faced. They had conquered countless civilizations, but none had met their weapons with such stubborn unity. To them, victory always meant isolation, weakness, division. Yet here humanity was showing the opposite. The plague, which was meant to divide, had instead forced them together. The very weapon that was supposed to erase Earth had given it something greater, a reason to stand as one. Within the cities, the shift was clear. Hospitals remained full, but hope returned where despair had lived. Children were given bowls of soup by strangers who smiled through their masks. Volunteers carried pots into dark alleys where the sick lay forgotten. Entire nations broadcast cooking programs, teaching families how to make their own resistance from whatever they had. Kitchens became symbols of life, stronger than laboratories or armies. For the first time since the plague began, laughter was heard again in homes. Songs returned to windows where silence once ruled. The alien commanders knew they could still destroy Earth with fleets and fire. But that was not the point. This had been meant to be proof that humans were fragile, that they could be broken like all others, yet the opposite had been revealed. Humans endured. They adapted, and they found strength in places the galaxy would never look. A bowl of soup had become more terrifying than 1,000 cannons because it meant that Earth would never fall the way the warlords wanted. The plague still ravaged the world, but its power was fading, and in its place something new was rising. A unity forged not by governments or armies, but by ordinary people with ordinary tools in kitchens and homes. The war had taken a turn, and the galaxy had begun to learn a lesson. It would not soon forget alien shock and human defiance. In the hidden command stations scattered across deep space, the alien coalition gathered to watch the outcome of their grand experiment. Their screens glowed with images of Earth's cities, not silent ruins as they had expected, but streets where smoke rose, not from burning buildings, but from thousands of kitchens cooking. In defiance, the commanders argued among themselves. Some insisted the data must be corrupted. Others claimed human scientists had found an unknown cure. But when the truth was revealed, a hush fell across the chamber. The ultimate plague, the masterpiece of their biological warfare, had been stopped by a meal, a primitive broth of poultry, herbs, and water. To the warlords, this was an insult beyond measure. They had spent centuries perfecting this weapon. It had reduced empires to dust and erased proud species from the galaxy. Yet here was Earth still alive, still breathing, still laughing in the face of death. One commander slammed his clawed hand against the table, demanding that the fleets descend immediately and burn the planet clean. Another hissed that such an act would reveal weakness. They had promised their allies that the plague alone was enough, that no species could resist. To send ships now would be to admit failure. The debate raged, but beneath it all, a single truth gnawed at them. Humanity had defied them. On Earth, the shift was even more dramatic. What had started as quiet whispers and desperate experiments had grown into global unity. Soup kitchens rose in every neighborhood. Volunteers ladled broth with the same determination as soldiers defending walls. The sick were carried into halls where strangers fed them and held their hands. Songs echoed through the night as people reminded each other that they were not alone. What the plague had intended to break it had instead bound together governments that once argued over borders now traded supplies freely. Scientists shared knowledge without secrecy, and ordinary families discovered that they were not powerless, but vital to the survival of the species. The alien watchers could not understand this. They were used to civilizations that fractured under pressure, where the sick were abandoned and the healthy fled. But humans did not behave as predicted. They refused to surrender even when science failed them. They turned to tradition to care, to hope. One alien strategist whispered that humanity was dangerous not because of its weapons or its armies, but because it carried strength in every household and every heart. This frightened him more than any fleet ever could. Among the people of Earth, a new fire was lit. Leaders stood before their citizens not with promises of hidden weapons or new discoveries, but with bowls of broth held high as symbols of defiance. They declared that humanity would not bow to fear. They would not collapse. As others had, they would endure together. What began as survival had transformed into defiance against the stars. Whispers spread that if the aliens were watching, then let them see. Let them see a planet united by something so simple they could never understand in homes and shelters. Children laughed again as they tasted food that reminded them of comfort families, told stories of resilience around pots that boiled late into the night. Neighbors who had never spoken before now treated each other as kin. Every act of care became an act of rebellion. The plague that was meant to erase Earth had instead revealed its soul. The alien coalition grew restless. Their pride was wounded and their authority shaken across the galaxy. Rivals whispered that the warlords had failed if Earth survived. Then others might question the power of the plague. What had once been a weapon of fear now threatened to become a symbol of weakness. Desperation crept into their councils as they considered new measures. Yet all agreed on one thing: humanity could no longer be dismissed. Back on Earth, the knowledge spread quickly. Scientists confirmed that the soup contained compounds that interfered with the plague, but the people already knew. They had seen it work. They had felt the difference. Hope had returned, and hope was stronger than any cure. The sickness was still present, but it no longer held the same terror. It no longer silenced the world. Instead, it fueled defiance, as every community declared that they would not only survive but live. The galaxy had expected Earth to fall instead. Earth had stood up stronger than before, with bowls raised high in unity. The aliens realized too late what kind of enemy they had chosen, an enemy that would fight, with everything, even with something as humble as chicken soup, turning the tide. The first months had been filled with fear and despair, but now the air of Earth carried something different, a steady rhythm of determination that no alien commander could calculate. The plague was still present, yet its power was fading every day as more kitchens turned into strongholds of defiance. Soup kitchens spread like wildfire across cities and villages. Great pots simmered in school stadiums, and even abandoned warehouses where volunteers ladled steaming bowls into the hands of the weak, and the broken lines of people stretched for blocks, not in panic but in unity, because everyone knew that this was no longer just food, it was survival, and it was proof that humanity would not bow. Scientists worked alongside the people, their laboratories no longer locked behind walls but open to share knowledge across borders. Samples of broth were studied and refined formulas created to maximize its healing properties, and soon new treatments emerged, combining tradition with science. The simple recipes were adjusted with vitamins and supplements, turning every meal into a shield against the plague in hospitals. Doctors who had once felt powerless now held new strength as they treated patients not with empty hands, but with cures forged from resilience itself. The aliens who watched these developments were thrown into chaos. Their models had predicted the extinction of humanity within months, yet Earth was recovering. The infection rates slowed and survival rates climbed higher than any simulation had considered. Commanders demanded explanations, but none came. Their scientists reviewed the data again and again, unable to accept that such A primitive method had turned the tide. Some suggested sending fleets to crush humanity directly, but others warned that such an act would reveal their failure to the entire galaxy. For the weapon they had boasted of for centuries had been defeated. By bowls of soup and community spirit the ground earth was transforming communities once divided by politics, religion, and culture. Now stood side by side. Every street, every neighborhood carried the same goal. Survival and unity became the weapons of the people. Young and old worked together. Strangers became family and kitchens became war rooms. The plague that was supposed to break them had instead forged them into something stronger than before. And in that strength, they found courage not only to survive but to challenge the idea that they were weak in the eyes of the stars. Media across the world showed images of children smiling again, of families reunited after recovery, of volunteers carrying steaming pots into dark alleys where once despair had ruled. The sound of coughing was still present, but alongside it came laughter, songs, and stories. Humanity was alive, and alive in a way that was louder and prouder than ever. The aliens who monitored Earth could not look away because every image told them that their victory was gone. As the weeks turned into months, scientists announced breakthroughs inspired by the soup, but elevated with modern medicine. New vaccines and treatments were developed using compounds discovered in the broth and strengthened by human ingenuity. Suddenly, the plague that had been undefeatable was now being pushed back, actively defeated on the battlefield of biology. The ultimate weapon of the alien coalition had not only failed, it had been undone by human tradition and innovation. Working hand in hand, this truth echoed across the galaxy, and with it, the myth of alien invincibility began to crumble. The alien commanders tried to silence the news, but information traveled fast through the stars. Whispers reached other species who had once lived in fear of the coalition. If humans could resist and survive, perhaps others could too. Perhaps the plague was not the end, but only a beginning. The coalition realized too late that their weapon had not only failed, it had empowered Earth and inspired the galaxy back on Earth. The fight was not over, but the people no longer trembled. The sick continued to recover, the strong continued to give, and the world began to heal. Kitchens remained, the heart of resistance, but now laboratories stood beside them, and armies no longer prepared for war with each other, but for defense against the stars. Earth had turned the tide, and the plague that was meant to erase them had instead become the fire that forged them into something unbreakable. Humanity had stood on the edge of extinction and found its answer not in despair but in unity. The aliens had given them their worst, and in return, humanity had shown its best. The tide had turned, and the warlords who had once laughed at Earth now sat in silence, knowing their time of power was ending. Humanity's victory. The day came when the plague that once haunted every street and filled every home with fear finally began to vanish. Doctors reported fewer new cases each week. Hospitals that had overflowed with suffering now saw empty beds. Volunteers who had once marched endlessly with heavy pots of broth now stood smiling as their work slowed the great enemy that had been designed to erase humanity had been undone not only by science but by the strength of unity and the will to endure. The world breathed again. The alien coalition could hardly believe the reports. Their ultimate weapon, the plague that had toppled empires, had failed utterly. The warlords who had once sat with pride and arrogance now sat in silence, broken by the undeniable truth. Earth had survived more than survived. It had adapted and grown stronger. They had watched through their cold machines as humans cooked, shared, sang, and fought back, not with ships or cannons, but with care and tradition. And that truth was more terrifying than any fleet could be. On Earth, the celebration was not marked by parades or fireworks, but by quiet gatherings in homes and communities. Families ate together, bowls steaming in their hands. Children laughed freely once more. Neighbors who had been strangers only months ago embraced as kin. It was a victory that belonged to everyone, not only to governments or scientists, but to the millions who had held each other through the darkest nights. The sickness had taken much, but it had not taken the spirit of humanity. If anything, it had revealed that spirit in its purest form. Scientists stood before the world and explained how the compounds in the broth had created pathways for stronger treatments, how tradition had guided them to discovery. But the people already knew. They did not need charts or formulas to tell them what had saved them. It was the act of caring, the refusal to let each other die alone. It was the stubborn belief that even against the greatest darkness, there was always something worth trying, even if that something was as simple as soup. Across the galaxy, whispers spread. Worlds that had lived in fear of the alien coalition heard the story, and for the first time in centuries they began to doubt the power of their overlords. The ultimate plague was no longer a weapon to be feared, but a tale of failure told in shame. The warlords who had built their empire on terror had been undone not by superior force but by the resilience of a species they had underestimated in their arrogance. They had given humanity the chance to prove itself, and humanity had answered with defiance. Back in the alien chambers, fury consumed the warlords. Some demanded fleets be sent to crush Earth with fire and steel, but others knew it was too late. The galaxy had seen their failure to attack now would only confirm their weakness to withdraw was humiliating, yet unavoidable, and so the command was given. Fleets that had waited on the edges of Earth's orbit turned away, their shadows retreating into the dark of space, leaving behind a planet they could no longer break. On Earth, the sight of the stars seemed different. People looked upward not with fear but with pride. They knew they had been tested by an enemy that had destroyed countless others, and yet they had survived. And more than that, they had done so together. They had shown that strength was not always found in weapons or in armies, but in unity and care. In the traditions that tied one generation to the next, humanity had given the galaxy an answer that could never be forgotten. As the years passed, the story became legend. Children were told of the time when the world almost fell but was saved not by soldiers but by families, not by bombs, but by bowls of soup. Songs were written, poems recited, stories shared across every culture to remind them that when the galaxy tested them, humanity stood and did not fall. The aliens had hoped to erase them. Instead, they had forged their identity stronger than ever. In the end, humanity did not just win against a plague, it won against the arrogance of those who believed they could break the spirit of Earth. The galaxy had learned a lesson that day: to underestimate humans was to invite humiliation. For they were a species that found strength even in the simplest of places, a species that refused to surrender, a species that could turn despair into victory. The aliens left with silence and shame, while Earth rose with unity and pride. And from that moment forward, every world that heard the story knew that humanity was not to be measured by the size of its armies but by the depth of its heart. The end of the plague and the beginning of humanity's legacy. The world that had once trembled beneath the weight of fear now stood tall, healed, not only in body but in spirit. The streets that had been silent with sorrow now echoed with voices and laughter. People gathered around fires and kitchens, remembering the days when a bowl of soup meant the difference between despair and hope. Children who had once coughed in dark hospital wards now ran freely through the parks while their parents watched with tears in their eyes. The sickness had not disappeared entirely, but it had been broken, and with it the illusion that humanity could be erased by a weapon designed in the arrogance of alien warlords. The alien coalition who had once sat with pride in their floating palaces now faced humiliation across the stars. Their greatest creation had become their greatest shame, and their empire built on fear began to tremble. Cracks appeared in their alliances as other species asked the forbidden question: if humans could survive, why not us? For the first time in centuries, the galaxy saw a glimmer of rebellion born not from weapons, but from a story of resilience. Earth had become more than just a planet, it had become a symbol. On Earth itself, there was no grand coronation, no triumphal armies marching. Instead, the victory was carried in the hands of ordinary people, in bowls passed from one to another in the memories of families who remembered the darkest nights and the comfort of warmth shared across borders, across cultures, across faiths. The divisions that once threatened to tear humanity apart seemed smaller now in the shadow of what they had overcome together. Kitchens had been their battleground, compassion had been their weapon, and unity had been their shield. Scientists continued their work, but their pride was tempered with humility, for they knew that without the stubborn traditions carried by countless generations, they might never have found the path to victory. Leaders spoke with new voices, not of conquest or dominance, but of endurance and responsibility. Humanity now understood that the stars were watching and that the future would not be shaped by arrogance, but by the same spirit that had carried them through the plague. the spirit of never leaving each other behind. The galaxy had underestimated Earth, and in doing so had revealed its true nature. Humanity was not fragile. Humanity was not easily broken. Humanity endured it, adapted it, fought back, not always with might but always with heart, and that was something no weapon could ever overcome. The story of the plague would live forever, as proof that when darkness came, humanity lit a fire. When despair spread, humanity shared hope, and when the stars tested them, humanity rose together. The aliens withdrew their fleets and carried their shame into the cold void, while Earth stood beneath the same stars. Now brighter than ever, the people knew they would be tested again one day, perhaps by war, perhaps by hunger, perhaps by another plague. But they also knew the truth that whatever came, they would face it together, and that together, there was nothing they could not overcome. And so the tale of the plague ended not with silence but with song, not with defeat but with a victory forged in kitchens and carried in the hearts of billions. The ultimate weapon had failed, the human spirit had triumphed, and the galaxy would never forget. The end.